Hello everyone, Garry Adelman, American Battlefield Trust, standing in the Marietta National Cemetery. We wanted to take a little bit of time to visit some of the cemeteries in the Atlanta area. You know, I think it's easy. We all know battles produce casualties, and some of those casualties are deaths or mortal wounds. And it's easy to forget that those battlefields were, and in many cases still are, cemeteries. The wholesale slaughter that occurred during the Civil War required that A, some of the battlefield burials will be missed, and B, because battles were fought on farms and on private property, there needed to be some way to move the remains off of these places while also trying to account for them in some sort of a appropriate burial, such as national cemeteries. So during the Civil War, they established national cemeteries, first around hospitals and things like that. But at the Battle of Gettysburg, they realized that they needed to establish a cemetery for the federal dead, to be able to organize them in some way on the battlefield for those who died there, okay? And thus, this movement of doing so was born, and we would have cemeteries at Antietam and Chattanooga, here at Marietta, and so many other places as well. The Confederates would establish their own cemeteries, sometimes in portions of other cemeteries as well. And I suppose what Kris and I want to do is just walk around this beautiful cemetery and reflect on what we see here. There are Civil War dead here right within your field of view: Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and smaller actions within there. You also see the spouses of some of these soldiers who fell as well. Now, national cemeteries tend to have a few things in common. Usually there's the text of the Gettysburg Address. Usually there's some organized manner of burial by state or otherwise. Here, not only are they mixed up by state, they are mixed up by war as well. We also have some other interesting things I think we're going to want to show you. So that's Kris White behind the camera. We're going to cut for a sec and walk around this beautiful place and visit some other cemeteries as well. Now, Kris, with so many lives memorialized around us, all with a military connection, what's it like for you when you walk around these places?
I think that this is a really beautiful and moving cemetery. If you remember, prior to the Civil War, there is a cemetery movement in the United States, and these are meant to be places that are almost like gardens where people will come to remember, to have picnics, to get together in a way, almost as a place to for a town to come together. And this is what they'll do after the American Civil War, whenever they put these cemeteries for the North and South together. So it's an unbelievably beautiful place, well kept, and it's a place for us to remember not just our Civil War dead here. I mean, we have a Revolutionary War soldier, War of 1812, Spanish-American War, the World Wars, all the way up through Vietnam. So this is a place to remember and reflect, I think, for generations.
And this is one of just numerous national cemeteries, not to mention all of the other cemeteries, church cemeteries, Confederate cemeteries. Now, Kris, you're focusing here on the 20th Corps Monument. What is the 20th Corps, and what does this have to do with this place?
So the 20th Corps is actually a portion of the 11th Corps and the old Union 12th Army Corps from the Army of the Potomac. They're shipped out to the Western Theater during the Chickamauga-Chattanooga campaign, and they are commanded by Joseph Hooker, former Union of the Army of the Potomac commander. And while these two corps, the 11th and 12th, did not kind of fit together or fit well with the Army of the Potomac, they really found a place for themselves here out in the Western Theater, and see a lot of action all the way up through Bentonville and Bennett Place in the Western Theater. And you can see the battle honors on here. This will say our dead heroes to the 20th Corps, 2nd Division, 20th Army Corps. This would be the Army of the Cumberland that they served in. And you'll see battle honors from Winchester, Virginia, Port Republic, Cedar Mountain, places where we helped to save land, and then all the way through here to Atlanta, because this monument is in 1864, so it kind of cuts off there in 1864 for us.
Now, what I wanted to say too, as I look around here, not only am I seeing a lot of what, because you mentioned this was the 11th and the 12th Corps, part of the 11th, you're seeing people you see out east. I see the 154th New York over there, Mr. Eggleston. They fought at Chancellorsville. Of course, I see the 102nd New York, which is an eastern, typically an eastern unit. The 73rd Pennsylvania has a monument on Howard Avenue at Gettysburg, and I see a couple of those. And what you're seeing is a real melange of soldiers east and west. And then we have a mix of soldiers from different wars and their wives. You may have noticed on the way in that we were showing the backsides of those graves, and sometimes you see the spouse of the veteran who always has a place in the cemetery, even if it's full. Your spouse can be buried in the national cemeteries as well.
And I think this is a stark reminder of the cost of war. Every headstone represents at least one human life here, if not their spouse, who also in some ways gave to whatever cause, North, South, the United States cause, and other wars. So you have to keep in mind that there's a lot of folks here. There's so many people buried here. This is the human side, the human cost of war. You can see the 2nd Minnesota, the 22nd Wisconsin, Michiganders down here, and the thousands of dead who are buried here from America's wars. They have a beautiful resting place here in Marietta, and we'll check out a few more spots along the way.
Kris, let's walk up this way because there's another sort of military monument here. But on the way, do you have any thoughts on this? They did not typically, although that's not always a hard and fast rule. At Santa Fe, they buried Confederate dead that they later found in with the Union dead. I mean, a lot of these national cemeteries were established during the war. And what do you think about this idea of burying the two sides separately, as we would in any other war we would do it? Do you have any reflections on that?
Well, as we look here, as we come forward, some of these are established during the American Civil War, some shortly thereafter. So we have to remember the hostilities are still there, that they are looking at themselves as the Confederates were enemy combatants. Whenever there were Marine exercises in 1922 in Gettysburg, they wouldn't fly a Confederate flag whenever they were representing Confederate soldiers because they were looked at as a combatant nation. So that's one of the reasons that they are not buried amongst the United States soldiers here. And it goes back to show the sectional strife. And as the war, or the years go on after the war, you do sometimes see that these cemeteries will include some Confederate dead because they're either found later on or transferred into these cemeteries. So it's an interesting question to have. You have to put yourself in the shoes of both the Northerners and the Southerners at the time. If you're a Southerner, do you want to be buried amongst the Northerners, and vice versa? So that's something that you need to keep in mind.
I think that last point is very important. People focus on that there aren't Confederate soldiers in most national cemeteries without considering that I don't see a whole lot of Union soldiers in Confederate cemeteries. You put themselves, like Kris said, back in their shoes, back into the time of the 1860s. And I think they saw their armies as different. And I don't think that there was a great movement to try to bury them all together at that point. But there are exceptions to every rule when it comes to monumentation, when it comes to memorialization and cemeteries and things like this. Now, Kris, what do we have going on up here?
So this is the On Wisconsin Monument. You'll see a badger at the top of here, but this is dedicated to the soldiers who died during the American Civil War in this area. And it has the different cavalry, artillery, and infantry regiments from the state of Wisconsin. There's the badger atop. And this sits at the highest peak of the Marietta National Cemetery. And I should point out, and I'm going to pan around here just to give you the size and scope of this cemetery. This is what we would consider, if we were in Europe, a concentration cemetery. What that means is we're going to take soldiers who served during the Atlanta campaign, United States soldiers, Northern soldiers, place them into one spot. They may not have necessarily been killed at Kennesaw Mountain or as a result of Kennesaw Mountain. They may have died during latter parts of the Atlanta campaign or earlier parts of the Atlanta campaign. But rather than have many small cemeteries like you will see scattered throughout Europe, especially with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission for Great Britain, you will find larger cemeteries like these to concentrate the burials. After the war, when we have other conflicts such as the Spanish-American War, and we have the World Wars, Vietnam, Korea, will expand the size and scope of many of these Civil War era cemeteries, and that's what you're seeing here. We're seeing a lot of soldiers who were buried from other conflicts. They're not necessarily killed in that conflict. They may have lived in this area and wanted to be buried in a national cemetery, or they were killed overseas and their bodies brought back home. The section that's coming up through here, and we'll double back here in a moment, is a very interesting section because it is to the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines who were killed in overseas action. Their bodies may not have been identified or brought home. There also may have been laid to rest at sea. They may have given their bodies to science, it says here, or they may have been cremated. So these headstones here don't necessarily have a body in the cemetery associated with it, but as you can see, it says in memory to these soldiers. We have a distinguished Flying Cross recipient towards the back, a captain with the United States Navy who survived both the Second World War and Korea. We have a man who was served in the Panama, our actions in Panama, and of course the Persian Gulf. We have others who are out here who were shot down over Europe, flying with the 8th Air Force. So we see a lot, or the 9th Air Force, we see a lot of soldiers from different walks of life, as well as our different conflicts.
And I think, we've already kind of covered this. We'll include some B-roll into here. We just walked through a beautiful rostrum, ivy covered, which is another feature of many national cemeteries. But I think what we're going to do is B-roll in some of the Medal of Honor recipients who are buried here. We'll show you the Revolutionary War soldier as well. And then as we come upon additional cemeteries, we will see those as well. And I just want to compliment real quick before we even move on, all of the people who maintain these national cemeteries, Confederate cemeteries, church cemeteries everywhere. You tend to come to most of these cemeteries and they are meticulously maintained. These are people who are sometimes working for the administration that does it, and sometimes they are volunteer groups like they do over in France for American Dead and otherwise. So I want to compliment them, because most cemeteries you go to, you hear the yard equipment going because they are very carefully mowing around all of these stones and whatnot, and compliments are due, because this is one beautiful place. Now here we are less than a mile away from the Marietta National Cemetery in the Marietta Confederate Cemetery, part of the Marietta City Cemetery. And here we have a different sort of situation. This cemetery was started during the war, the product largely of an accident, a train accident that involved soldiers. Mr. Glover allowed to be buried on his property. That was followed eventually by 3,000 plus more Confederate soldiers who had perished and been buried closer to the Chickamauga battlefield, Kolb's Farm, Kennesaw Mountain, everything between Chickamauga and basically the Chattahoochee River. So 3,000, one of the larger Confederate cemeteries around here. What you're seeing is a somewhat different approach. Some of the features in the cemetery we'll talk about as we walk around. But let's take a few steps over here. That's Kris White behind the camera. We're going to walk around this cemetery a little bit here. Now, as you approach these graves here from the back, what I want to do is look at the front, because these soldiers, there is an unknown section, but they are set up around here by state. Every Confederate state is represented. But if you walk maybe one more row in, and then we turn around, what you're going to see is these are blank headstones. They were originally wooden headstones with most of the names actually on them, but apparently nobody kept a record of them, because when they all washed away and had worn away by the early 1900s, the names were not recorded, and therefore, from what I can tell, at least 98% of those Civil War dead, those who died in battle, who are represented here, are actually unknown. So they're within a state plot, that much they knew. But then they also have a different section over here. What you're going to see is a much different approach. These are the dead who actually died in soldiers' homes. These soldiers are identified very particularly. Kris?
Yeah, you can see here you have the 16th Georgia, who did not serve here in the Western Theater, but they're an Eastern Theater unit. You have the North Carolina Reserves and others who would have served here. And back in the back there, you can see the Confederate veterans who died at the Soldiers' Home of Georgia. Almost every state had more than one soldier home where they could go, almost a retirement home for these soldiers where they were taken care of. And that's where they will pass away. And it denotes, and you can see on some of them, they do have their either birth date and death date, or their birth year and death year, like you'll see back here with these two gentlemen, one from the old Stonewall Brigade of the 5th Virginia, 1844 to 1923, and then of course over here to the 64th Alabama, 1845 to 1923. You should note, cemeteries north and south, when these men are buried, most of the time they're going to use wooden headboards, as Garry pointed out. They'll be painted. Sometimes you might have their names painted on there or scratched in. So over time, especially here in the South, you're going to have these things out in the elements, these headstones. And with the elements of rain, the heat, the humidity, the paint peels away, they're not tended to, and that's how we lose the names of so many Civil War soldiers. That's why you have so many unknowns. Yes, they were not using dog tags as we know them today, but more importantly, when they are marking the dead of the knowns, they're not mapping these cemeteries, and they are not using stone initially to etch the names forevermore.
And the longer you waited, I mean, we are in the South. By the way, most of the Civil War casualties would occur in the South. And here we are in the South that had big economic problems at the end of the Civil War, and it took until 1866 to scrape up the money to move these 3,000 soldiers here in the first place. And what I'll say is that you hear in the background, we're walking away from some of the noise of the grass cutting equipment and leaf blowers, because these places are maintained very carefully. Some of those people, by the way, if you'll pan to the right, Kris, are referenced on some of the memorials and other plaques outside of the National Cemetery, of the Confederate Cemetery here. And you see sort of a park that really explains this cemetery a little bit more. All the names of those known to be buried here are listed on some of the plinths. They also have the battles and that they fought in, and the states that they came from as well. So as you walk around here, you're seeing soldiers whose names are unknown, who actually died during the war. And by the way, these are some of the more fortunate ones in terms of remains, because it would take sometimes the better part of a decade to scrape up the funds to start to remove soldiers from northern battlefields or closer to northern battlefields, such as Gettysburg, Antietam, and others, and actually move them south. But you have a Confederate cemetery movement because these battles are fought in the South. There are a lot of these local church cemeteries where you have 1, 10, 20, and 50 soldiers actually buried near, in the churches of that particular town near the battlefield. So it's a different approach.
Yeah, and I'd point out too, you have to read the headstones. This one, for instance, is definitely a modern headstone sitting beside one of those blank tablets or blank headstones. And if you go around the back side of Thomas Sanford's grave, you'll see in memoriam. So a lot of times what you're seeing are headstones placed within these cemeteries where the soldiers may be not necessarily buried, or he may be buried in these grounds. We just don't know where he is specifically buried. So if you read the headstones, read the markers, memorials, tablets when you go to battlefields, which is very important to do to understand them and their settings, that'll give you a better understanding. And one of the things I want to mention is when we left the Marietta National Cemetery, over top of the archway it would say, honoring the more than 10,000 defenders of the Union who were there in that cemetery. So there are more than 10,000 initial burials there of Northern Union Yankee soldiers, United States soldiers, whatever you want to call them there. And in this cemetery, you'll see the term hero used over and over again. And this goes to show you the differences of the two sides, remembering, memorializing, how they're coping with their war dead, how they're remembering these men. And many times when we come to cemeteries, we go to battlefields, we are seeing the memories of people maybe a generation or more removed. And that reflects as much the people of the time that they're memorializing as the people who are doing the memorializing themselves. So that's something that's always interesting. And with this being another concentration cemetery, meaning they're bringing soldiers from many different places here to one spot, these would have been soldiers from across the Confederacy and across many battlefields brought here to Marietta into the Old City Cemetery for reburial.
For many people, places like this, battlefields, are not easy. And one thing I'll know is that telling somebody how to feel is a fool's errand. And for some people, for many people, these places are complex. How do I feel about something like the Civil War? How do I feel about the way that these things are being memorialized? And that goes for cemeteries, for monuments, and otherwise. I would only encourage anybody, I'm not going to do that fool's errand and tell you how to feel, but I would encourage you to look at the whole story. It's easy for us in our society to desire to have one reason why the war was fought, why it started, one reason why soldiers fought from the North and for the South, and in fact, There are a lot of different reasons, I would say scores, if not hundreds of different reasons why soldiers fought, and they wrote these in their diaries as the war went on, and sometimes they changed. Some soldiers signed up right at the beginning, some signed up later, and some were actually drafted. Okay, so that might point out some differences north and south as well. So I come to places like this, like cemeteries, and for my part, again, I'm not telling you how to feel, but for my part, I think of the dead, I think of these people as when they were younger. In the case of the soldiers' home, I think of them later, and I think someone's life is a lot broader than what they did for the 1 day or 4 years that they fought during the Civil War. And that's, I don't necessarily feel that way on battlefields, but when I come to cemeteries north or south, I sort of end up with that vibe. A quick stop here in the St. James Cemetery in Marietta to visit the grave of Alfred Rudolph Waud, well known as a sketch artist in the Civil War, photographed several times during the Civil War, later touring Civil War battlefields in this area. He died in Marietta in 1891. I would say he's most probably well known not only for his artworks, but for the famous picture he has in the slaughter pen at Gettysburg National Military Park. Now, let's walk a little bit further. As we walk along at the same cemetery, I just find it interesting that among the many people buried in this lovely cemetery is one Jean-Benet Ramsey. You might remember the sensational court case, killed on Christmas, and it became big national news for a long time. So in the same cemetery, not too far from one another, here we have actually Alfred Waud, who produced works of art for a big national event, namely the Civil War, but he did other things as well. And then we have the subject of a national news story as well. Indeed, cemeteries are places you can contemplate for hours on end. So now we have come further south. We're near Americus, Georgia, and we are at the Andersonville National Cemetery. We're joined by Terry Serber, who's a ranger here at the Andersonville National Historic Site. Terry, how long you worked here?
Just about 4 years.
Okay, good. And here we are in this cemetery. Is this whole cemetery just the dead from Andersonville?
No, it's not. So we are still an active national cemetery. That means that we currently have first interment burials here. We do about 200 burials a year. Now, what we're standing in right now is, of course, the Civil War section, and you can tell the difference when you look at the site. But right now we have just over 22,000 total burials. 12,920 are Civil War prisoners that were here.
Okay, and you mentioned you can tell. Well, one thing is, I've never been to a national cemetery like this, or any cemetery, with the graves so close together. Why?
Again, as they're burying guys here, now it's the prisoners themselves that are doing the burials. That's typical of Civil War prisons. You're going to guys have paroled out to do that. What they do is, so they're going to dig a trench. The trenches are, as you can see, a little over 7 to 8 feet wide, about 150 feet long. And they bury them basically by the time you're getting to this point, it's just shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. So they are buried, very, very closely together because of the numbers that they're having. What happens though is they are where their headstone says they are in this cemetery. A lot of Civil War prisons would just, mass bury everybody, put a marker, and say this is a bunch of Union or Confederate soldiers. But here they attach a number to each man. It corresponds to their name on the death registry, and so they do mark that with a stake during the Civil War time. So they are where their headstone says they are, but very, very, very close, just because of the numbers that are dying each day.
And I think there's a story, as I remember, about that registry. This was a prisoner, maybe a paroled prisoner, keeping this registry?
Yeah, the main one that most people hear about is Dorrance Atwater. He's not the only person that did. We actually got recently a donation from another prisoner that gave his list to Dorrance Atwater after the war was over. Yeah, Dorrance, he had paroled out as a clerk in the hospital. So he's writing names down. He goes back, copies the list from before he was there, and then secretly keeps a second copy of the whole list, sneaks it out, and then contacts Clara Barton. She ends up coming down here when the cemetery is established. And helps with that as well. So it's just really, really quite a story.
What a comfort. I just assume you probably have descendants of these men come here. What a comfort it must be to them.
All the time, right. I mean, it's kind of an emotional place for people. When they come out here, you're walking where your ancestor was, especially, going into the North Gate. Yeah, it's really emotional, especially not even for people that have ancestors here, but for a lot of people in general. You look at it and you think about what these guys suffered for us, know, it's really, it's a special place. No other place like it.
Yeah, when I first came here, my first time here, I was a new parent. And suddenly that throws into relief, naming these kids. I'm still thinking about it.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
we talked about, guys joining the Civil War. It's heroic. It's adventurous. I'm going to go and, do something patriotic and fun, be a soldier, and then they end up someplace like this. Guys lie about their age. You see pictures of some of the men that were here. If you're not 18, you're definitely, younger than that. One in particular is a kid named Stephen Small. Now he's one of the Irish immigrants that come here, but he's so young and such a tragic little life. He was probably 13 or 14. The guards here are the same thing. A lot of them, 14, 15 years old, they were too young to be drafted into the regular army. And as Sherman's coming into Georgia, they've got to send the regular guard troops out of here and replace them with those Georgia reserves, which are people too young or too old to be already in the army. So you end up with 14-year-old guards even here,
Since you brought it up too, where I assume some of the Confederates died while they were working here, commissary, guards, paperwork, otherwise, where were they buried?
So they are buried kind of right about where the maintenance building is now. So the cemetery is established right after the war. The official date of the cemetery establishment is July 26th of 1865. They enclosed about more than you see now. In the 1870s, they put in the brick, the brick wall that's up here now. They leave the Confederate guards outside, which at the time is what you do. You're not going to put Confederates in a national cemetery in 1870. So by 1880, the locals reinter them into Oak Grove Cemetery in the Americas. So there's about 118 of those guys that died here as guards. Again, some of them young, some of them are older. Nobody wants to be here at Andersonville for sure. Guard or prisoner, either way.
I think you're right. And we'll have other videos that will talk about the Andersonville experience. And I do want to see more of the cemetery and talk about the broader view. But just because you're in this rare position of interacting with the public at a place like this, I assume you get people happy, sad, angry, lashing out. How do you deal with telling people today that, about the horror of what happened, the people who want to compare Andersonville to something else? Well, it was worse at X or Y place.
Right.
How do you help make sense of that?
Yeah, we get that a lot, obviously. For us here, we're trying to tell what happened. Now, every Civil War prison camp is bad. Union, Confederates, nobody does well. Throughout prisoner of war history, nobody does well with prisoners of war. They're used, as pawns in different political things, there's retaliation going on. If you're going to treat our guys this way, we're going to do it to yours. Nobody really does very good. One of the prisons just had to be the worst, and Andersonville is just it. So we're usually compared to Elmira prison. We can go stats all day long, but the fact is you start splitting hairs at that point. They're all bad. We're here to talk about all prisons of war in American history. So we do talk about, Union prisons with Confederate soldiers in them. And of course, we're here too. But one of them just had to be the worst, and Andersonville was just it.
Yeah, and I see your coverage in the visitor center, in the prisoner of war experience. I see Fort Warren, I see Marion, Indiana, I see Elmira, I see Johnson's Island, I see Salisbury, and I see the other ones in the South. I see Libby Prison.
Right.
So it's just my hat's off to you for everything you and the team do to interact with the public at this tough spot. Now, I do want to talk a little bit more about the cemetery and get walking. So let's give it a cut here. Check out more of it.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust's YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.